On my 65th birthday, my own son looked me in the eye and said, "Dad, it's time you retire. You're too old for this business." He took everything I built, but what he didn't know was that for 40 years I'd been quietly investing $10 a month. Silently. Patiently. And that changed everything. My name is Eugene Gene Parker. I'm 65 years old, founder of Parker Freight Group, a company I built from nothing but my own hands, sweat, and faith. And this is my story. I still remember that morning as clearly as if it were projected frame by frame in my mind. Ohio was cold and sharp, a silver light cutting through the fog. Dew clung to the windshield as I drove to the office. People looked away when I passed, but I thought nothing of it. Maybe they were planning a surprise. 30 years of loyalty had me believing that today they would celebrate what we had built together. I didn't know the special meeting my son had called was the obituary for my career. The conference room lights were bright, the air thick with the smell of coffee and new paper. Brian sat at the head of the table. My son, 35, crisp suit, perfect hair, confidence, sharpened by youth. Around him, the bored, younger faces, mostly people he'd hired over the past 2 years. The screen behind him glowed with a title slide, Organizational Restructure and Strategic Transition. Before I could even sit, Brian spoke, calm, detached, the tone of a man delivering a quarterly report. "Dad, the board has agreed it's time for you to rest. You'll stay on as founder emeritus, but the operations, the direction will be led by me and the new team." I asked one question. "You really think I've lost my value?" He didn't look at me. The world moves faster now. It needs people who understand data, not stories from the past. I looked around that room at the same people who once called me mentor, leader, friend. No one met my eyes. Someone slid a white envelope across the table, termination papers, severance package, retirement clause. I rested my hand on the table-cool oak under my palm and remembered the day Eleanor and I picked that table during our first business trip to Chicago. I used to believe that things built with honesty could last. The meeting ended in silence. No applause, no handshakes, just the hum of the projector and the rustle of paper. I packed my files into my old leather briefcase, the one Eleanor had given me when we opened our first warehouse. In the hallway, I turned back to the sign on the wall, Parker & Sons Freight. The same blue letters I'd painted myself in 1985. The sunlight from the glass door hit them gleaming, as if mocking the idea of permanence. The parking lot was empty. I sat in my old Ford pickup engine off, watching through the rearview mirror as Brian shook hands with a partner in the lobby. He smiled the confident smile of a man who believed he was stepping into a new era. I started the engine. My hand trembled slightly. On my ring finger, the silver wedding band caught the light. I'd worn it every day since Eleanor died, and today it was the only thing that still felt like mine. The radio came on mid-sentence, a segment about driverless trucks, about automation, about a future where no one would need men like me. I turned it off. A faint laugh escaped me. I had spent my life believing in people in hands that could fix, build, and promise. Maybe that's why I no longer fit in a world that only believed in algorithms. When I got home, the house in Cedarville felt hollow. The front door creaked like it hadn't been opened in years. The air smelled of wood and cold coffee. 2 chairs at the kitchen table. One for me, one for Eleanor, still stood facing each other. I set down my briefcase, sat across from her photo. It was taken in the backyard in 2017. The lavender in full-bloom sunlight tangled in her hair. She was smiling, teacup in hand. I stared at that photo for a long time before whispering, "They did it, Ellie. They took everything." From the drawer I pulled the birthday card she'd written the year she passed. Her handwriting was small, neat, slightly shaky. "Time doesn't take away your worth, Gene. It just tests who's patient enough to hold on." I ran my fingers over the words, as if the ink itself could still hold her warmth. By evening, the sun bled across the window, spilling gold over the kitchen. I made a fresh cup of coffee and carried it to the porch. Across the street, my neighbor was mowing the lawn, his dog barking once before lying back down. Life was still moving indifferent and steady while I sat there, a man quietly erased from his own creation. The sky dimmed. I stayed until the light was gone, listening to the world breathe without me. In my mind, everything blurred together: the first truck Eleanor and I painted with our hands, the sleepless nights at the first warehouse, the meals eaten on crates between shifts. All those memories pointed to one truth: I had given everything to Parker and Sons, only to be told I no longer belonged to the very name that bore my blood. The Ohio night was silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant echo of a train. I looked down at my wedding band, its dull silver catching the lamplight, and I heard her voice, soft, familiar, firm. "Don't let anyone tell you when to stop, Gene." I nodded. They thought I was finished. They thought they'd taken everything. But they didn't know there was still one thing left, small, steady, and silent. Something that had been growing quietly for 40 years, just waiting for the right moment to reveal its worth. The next morning, I woke to the first light slipping through the blinds. The house in Cedarville was so still, I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. The smell of yesterday's coffee lingered faintly in the kitchen. The room was neat, quiet, almost sterile, the kind of order that comes from absence, not peace. Eleanor's picture sat where it always had, beside the birthday card she'd written to me the last year before she passed. The handwriting was thin but steady, each stroke preserved through time. "Never let go of what you believe in." I stared at those words until my throat tightened. Then softly, almost to myself, I said, "They just did, Ellie." The screen door creaked against the wind. I stood there for a moment, then stepped out onto the porch. The steps were covered in dry leaves that crackled under my shoes. Across the street, Mrs. Jenkins was watering her roses. She looked up, waved. I nodded back. Maybe she didn't know, or maybe she pretended not to, that the man living across from her had just been pushed out of his own company by his son. I didn't blame anyone. But being cut out of the world you built with your own hands has a way of making everything around you feel foreign. By noon, the doorbell rang. A man in a gray suit stood on the porch holding a thick envelope. He introduced himself as a legal representative for Parker Logistics. His tone was polite, his words precise. "Mr. Parker, this is the final transfer document. If you sign, your retirement benefits will be released this month." I opened the envelope. The figure printed on the page was small enough to sting 4 decades of work reduced to something that could cover a few months of mortgage. I said thank you, folded the papers once, then again, then tore them clean through and dropped the pieces into the trash can beside the door. The man stood there a moment, his face unreadable, before saying quietly, "I understand." He turned and walked down the gravel path. The sound of his footsteps faded until there was nothing left but the wind. That afternoon, I couldn't sit still. I grabbed my keys and drove toward the industrial district where the main warehouse stood. The road was familiar, the same stretch lined with oak trees I'd planted myself the first year the company expanded. From a distance, the new sign glared white against the sky, Parker Logistics, Inc. My name was still there, but it didn't belong to me anymore. It felt like reading my own headstone. I parked on the shoulder and cut the engine. Outside the gate, a few young employees were smoking by the curb. One of them saw me and froze. He looked down, tugging his jacket to hide the logo on his chest. Another quickly crushed his cigarette and walked inside. No one came to greet me. I didn't take it personally. Loyalty isn't a virtue anymore. It's a liability. I stood there behind the iron fence, watching the trucks with their new paint jobs roll in and out. Each engine rev sounded like a punch to the chest. I remembered every bolt, every shipment, every stormy night Joe Ramirez and I had slept in that warehouse to guard the cargo. Joe was gone too, replaced like I was erased, like the company photo that once hung in the lobby. A man came out of the office, tall, clean-cut. It took me a moment to recognize Tom, the accountant who'd been with me for 20 years. He hesitated, then walked toward the fence. "Mr. Parker," he said quietly. I don't even know what to say. Everything happened so fast. I smiled, or tried to. "You're still here?" He nodded, eyes down. "Yeah, for now." "Are they happy, Tom?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said softly, "Maybe they think they are." I nodded once, thanked him, and got back in the truck. I drove slowly around the back lot, the one we used to test our first fleet of trucks. Years ago, Eleanor had stood there with a cup of coffee in her hands and said, "This is where it all began." The wind pushed through the open window, carrying the faint smell of oil and asphalt, the scent of memory. For a moment, I felt like a stranger trespassing on the ruins of his own life. At the edge of the district, I stopped at the old intersection. The traffic light blinked yellow. Across the street, the small diner where Brian and I used to eat after long shifts was still there, some faded awning, but new owners, a young couple cleaning tables inside. I stayed in the truck, watching through the glass. For a split second, I saw him again, 10 years old, flour on his cheek, grinning as I taught him how to calculate his first delivery profit. That boy once said, "Dad, I want to work here forever." The sky turned amber. The sun slid behind the warehouses, painting everything in a tired shade of orange. I drove aimlessly past the town center, down the same streets I once knew by heart. A new billboard towered above the highway, Brian's face smiling beside a group of young executives. The slogan read, "Parker Logistics, the future of freight." I glanced once, then turned away. They could print my name anywhere they wanted, but they'd never print the trust that built it. By the time I got home, darkness had settled. I didn't turn on the lights. The soft orange glow from the street lamp spilled through the window, landing on the kitchen floor. The refrigerator hummed. The old wooden chair by the fireplace still had the scratch Eleanor used to tease me about fixing. I sat down feeling not old, but left behind like the world had simply moved on without me. I reached for her card again, unfolded it, read the words I already knew by heart. "They can take everything, Gene, but they can't take your faith in yourself." I placed it back on the table, looked up at her picture. My voice broke the stillness of the room. "Eleanor," I whispered. "I kept my promise. I haven't let go." Outside, the wind stirred the trees, the chime on the porch clinking softly. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. In the darkness, I saw the old Parker and Sons sign the faces of those who'd once stood beside me, the years that would never return. And somewhere amid all that loss, I felt something still there, small, steady, silent. something that had survived everything, like time itself, patient, unseen, and waiting. 3 weeks had passed since I walked out of Parker Logistics. The house in Cedarville was still as silent as the morning I first came back. Every day began the same way: the hiss of the kettle, the slow drip of coffee into the glass pot, the faint murmur of the radio. I would let the news play just long enough to hear about the future. I no longer belonged to driverless trucks, data platforms, young entrepreneurs redefining the freight industry. Then I'd turn it off before the segment ended. I'd sit there a while watching the steam rise, thinking of the winters when I used to crawl under broken axles in the snow just to keep a shipment moving. In the afternoons, I drove Highway 62, the same stretch that once led to our main warehouse. The landscape had changed. A new billboard rose above the trees, bright and polished Brian's face in a tailored suit beside the words Parker Logistics, moving America forward. I pulled over, stared at it for a long moment. I didn't feel angry, just estranged. I turned the truck around, cut through the old industrial district. Behind the fence, a group of kids were filming a social media ad, laughing, posing in front of the same loading dock where I used to teach new drivers how to check their brakes. A newly painted blue truck rolled out of the gate, sleek, quiet, efficient. I could tell from the sound it wasn't built for endurance, only for speed. As the sky turned gold, I stopped at the corner market to buy bread and milk. The cashier, a young woman with Tom's eyes, his daughter, I realized smiled warmly. "Mr. Parker, how have you been?" I just nodded, exchanged a few polite words, and left. On the drive home, I rolled down the window. The autumn wind came rushing in, carrying the scent of cold air and distant fields. Thursday afternoon, while I was sweeping leaves off the porch, someone knocked on the door. When I opened it, I froze. Joe Ramirez stood there, taller than I remembered, hair, now streaked with gray, the same rough jacket he'd worn for years. His eyes held that mix of humor and fatigue only old truckers carry. "Joe," I said, "you're still around?" He smiled faintly. "They let me go last week, said I wasn't adaptable enough." I laughed once, a dry, brittle sound. "So they've replaced everyone who actually knows how to drive." We sat in the kitchen, 2 mugs of coffee between us. The silence stretched until Joe broke it. "You heard what Brian's been up to?" I shook my head. "He's expanding south. Took out a big loan from the bank. But something's off. Heard from one of the old dispatch guys that the books aren't clean. Money's moving between branches. Numbers don't match. Feels like someone's covering a hole." I looked down at my cup. The surface gone cold. My mind drifted to nights long ago. Eleanor and I sitting at this same table, going over ledgers line by line, making sure every cent had a place. I'd taught Brian the same discipline, how to see through the illusion of numbers. Now he was the one letting them lie. Joe studied me. "What are you gonna do, Gene?" "I don't know," I said. "Maybe just keep living." He nodded slowly. "Heard they're changing the logo again, dropping the Parker name altogether." I smiled, faint bitter. "They can repaint every truck in America, Joe. History still leaves fingerprints." He leaned back, shaking his head. "You know, I used to tell the young guys how you built this company from 2 trucks and a loan. They think I'm making it up." That evening, we drove to Helen's Diner, the same corner cafe we'd eaten at 100 times before. The place hadn't changed. The wood floors still creaked. The walls were covered with photos of the local baseball team. Helen herself was behind the counter, hair tied up, apron faded from years of coffee stains. "Mr. Parker," she said, beaming, as she came over to shake my hand. "Haven't seen you in ages." "Just taking it easy," I said. We sat by the window, ordered burgers and black coffee. She poured mine without asking. She still remembered how I liked it. Joe talked while I listened. About new management, the fancy systems, the spending that didn't make sense. I watched the reflection of streetlights on the glass, my face blurred in the dark. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally. Giving Brian the company so early, I took a long sip before answering. Maybe I regret teaching him how to win, but not how to lose. The wind pushed lightly through the half-open window, rustling the curtain. The bell above the door jingled a sound so familiar, it made me look up. Across the street, a truck passed slowly under the lamplight. The silver paint was dull, the old Parker Freight logo barely visible. Faded, but still there. I knew that truck, every curve, every dent. I'd painted it myself. Whoever was driving it now probably had no idea they were carrying a piece of my past. Helen refilled our cups, smiling. "Ever think of getting back in the game, Mr. Parker?" I hesitated. "Maybe I never really left." She laughed softly. "Parker Freight built this town. Some things you can't cover up with a new coat of paint." When we left, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of roasted coffee and diesel smoke. Joe shook my hand. "If you ever need anything, I still got my old truck." I nodded. "I'll remember that." He drove off into the night, his taillights fading down Main Street. I stood on the sidewalk for a while, watching the diner's neon sign flicker above the door. Helen's Diner glowing weak, but stubborn. In my head, I heard Eleanor's voice again, soft, steady, sure. "You can't control the world, Gene, but you can control how you live in it." I exhaled, looked down the quiet road, stretching ahead, the sodium lights painting the asphalt, pale and endless. A chapter had closed, but somewhere in the stillness beneath the dust of what used to be something small was moving again, slow, patient, alive, as if time itself was waiting for me to begin. That night, Cedarville was colder than usual. The wind moved through the cracks of the old window frame, carrying with it the sound of dry leaves brushing together like whispers from another time. I sat alone in the living room. The coffee in my cup had long gone cold. On the radio, a financial report hummed in the background, the rise and fall of numbers beating like the heart of someone else, far removed from my world. Then a single line caught my attention. The host was talking about forgotten retirement accounts, old IRAs opened decades ago now, worth hundreds of times their original value. I froze. The lamplight threw a dull glow across the wall, and for the first time in a long while, a thought stirred inside me. Did I ever leave something behind? Something that time hadn't erased. I went down to the basement. The air was damp, filled with the scent of old wood and paper dust. When I flipped on the light, the room seemed to wake up rows of boxes stacked high. Their labels faded, their contents brittle with age. I knelt beside one marked Parker Freight, financial records. Inside were contracts, receipts, ledgers, artifacts from a lifetime of work. I searched through them quietly, each layer of paper, like peeling back another year of my life. Then beneath a stack of invoices, I found a small wooden box. The carved pattern on the lid stopped me cold. It was Eleanor's. She used to keep what she called living keepsakes inside. I brushed off the dust and opened it. There were a few photographs, a silver bracelet, and a worn brown notebook with the corners frayed and edges soft with age. On the cover, barely visible, were the words IRA, 1985. I just sat there staring. Those letters felt alive, humming quietly under the light. A memory unfolded. I was 25. My father, Frank Parker Sr., had taken me to the bank in Millhaven. He told me a man should save something for himself, not for today, but for who he'll be later. At the time, I didn't care about later. I only wanted to earn enough to buy my first truck. But he opened the account for me, an individual retirement account, $10 a month, into some index fund I didn't understand. He said, just leave it. Let time do its work. I did as he said, and then I forgot. Now, decades later, I sat in the basement holding that same book. I turned its pages carefully. The ink had faded, some words barely legible, but the bank's seal was still there, 1985. I laughed softly somewhere between irony and disbelief. That account had to be long closed. And even if it wasn't, what could $10 a month possibly become after all this time? Still, I couldn't shake the curiosity. I brought the box upstairs and placed the notebook on the coffee table. That night, I hardly slept. I thought of my father, how he lived frugally, almost stubbornly, so how his advice once felt like a weight I didn't need. He died in 1999. Leaving nothing but an old house and a sense of dignity he treated like a family heirloom. And I wondered, was this his real gift? The one I'd never unwrapped. The next morning, the sky was heavy with gray. The air smelled of rain and iron. I ate a piece of toast got in the truck and drove toward Millhaven. The streets were both familiar and strange. The old hardware store, now a coffee shop, the gas station replaced by a phone repair kiosk. The Midwest Credit Union stood on the corner of Main, the same red brick building my father once walked me into, only cleaner, now renovated, but still holding its bones. When I pushed open the glass door, a soft chime rang. The air inside was warm, polished, faintly scented with espresso and lemon cleaner. A young woman at the counter looked up, blonde hair pulled back neatly, name tag reading Brittany. I set the notebook on the counter. I need to ask about an old account, I said. Very old. She took one look and let out a low whistle. Wow, I've never seen one of these in person. This thing might be older than me. I smiled. It probably is. She called for the branch manager. A tall woman appeared, dark hair, pinned up, glasses thin and precise. Her nameplate read Clara Holstead. She greeted me with a professional smile, but her eyes carried curiosity. Mr. Parker, come with me. I'd love to take a look at that. Her office was small, bright, and orderly. Morning light filtered through the blinds, catching on the edge of a photo frame, a family picture, a sign of stability. Clara opened her computer, typed in the long, faded account number from the cover. The screen flickered, then shifted into an old DOS interface green text on a black background. She chuckled softly. This system's ancient. We almost never use it anymore. I stood beside her, watching her fingers move. Then suddenly she stopped. Her expression changed. My chest tightened. What is it? She removed her glasses, looked at me, then back at the screen. It appears your account still exists. For a second I thought I'd misheard. Still exists. She nodded slowly, meaning it was never closed, and someone continued making contributions for years after it was opened. I felt the room tilt slightly. That can't be right. My father started it for me, but I never added anything after that. Clara scrolled through a list of transactions. $10 a month from 1985 to 2002, then $15 a month until 2005. I could barely swallow. Someone kept paying in. She hesitated. Could your father have maintained it? I shook my head. He passed away in '99. The math hung between us. 6 more years. And then it hit me. Eleanor. She must have done it quietly, never mentioning it. She always believed in letting time work its slow magic. Her words came back like a whisper. Saving isn't about money. It's how you make time work for you. My hands trembled. Clara printed a short statement, sliding the paper toward me. The balance isn't showing here, she said. We'll need to pull it from the central archive. Then she smiled, her voice softening. But I'll say this, Mr. Parker, your father and your wife must have believed in the power of time more than most people I've met. I took the paper, thin, weightless, yet it felt like holding a piece of both of them, my past, folded into a single sheet. Outside, the rain had started again, tapping gently on the windows. Clara said it would take a few days to verify everything. I thanked her, nodded, and stepped back out into the cold. The air was damp, but my chest felt warm for the first time in months. When I sat back in the truck, the old notebook rested on the passenger seat. Small, silent breathing with me. I turned the key, watched the wipers push aside the thin veil of rain. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I'd touched something still alive, something time hadn't managed to take away. 2 days later, I returned to the Midwest Credit Union. The sky was clear, but the wind was sharper, sweeping dry leaves across the brick walkway in slow, circling spirals. Clara Holstead was waiting in her office. She stood when I entered, smiling the kind of smile that precedes a secret. On the desk sat an old computer, black screen, green text, blinking like something from another century. I placed the worn leather notebook on the table and sat down. My chest tightened the way it does before you open a door that leads somewhere you can't predict. Clara adjusted her glasses and began typing. The soft, rhythmic clicks filled the quiet room. For a long time she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the screen. The light from the window hit her lenses, hiding her expression. Finally, I asked, barely above a whisper, "So, it's been closed?" She stopped, took off her glasses, and looked straight at me. "No, Mr. Parker," she said. "It's still active." For a second, I thought I'd misheard. Still active. What do you mean? She turned the monitor toward me. Her voice was calm, low, deliberate. I mean, it's never been closed. Not once. And as of this morning, the balance is $1,875,000. The words didn't land all at once. They hovered in the air between us like static. Then the numbers on the screen came into focus. 1,875,000. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then out of nowhere, a soft laugh escaped me. Half disbelief, half relief. Clara said nothing. She just placed her hand lightly over the folder, grounding me to the moment. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a faded yellow envelope sealed with red wax. The wax had cracked, but the handwriting across the front was unmistakable. Frank Parker Sr. Clara said gently. The file indicates this was to be released only when the beneficiary appeared in person. I took it carefully, my hands trembling. The paper was brittle. The seal broke with a dry snap. Inside was a single folded sheet yellowed by time. The scent of old paper and cedar rose up, mixing with the faint smell of dust and age. The first line stopped me cold. If you're reading this, Sun Life has probably knocked you down. Remember, true value takes time. Never let anyone measure your worth by your age. There will be days when people decide you're no longer needed, and you'll start to believe them. Don't. Your worth doesn't vanish. It only goes quiet until someone patient enough sees it again. I believe you'll find it when you need it most. Sat there, unable to blink, the words pulsing through me like a heartbeat from the past. I could hear my father's voice, steady, unyielding, see his hands calloused and thick from decades in the steel mill. He wasn't a man of speeches. He taught by doing. Up before dawn, always with the same ritual splash cold water on his face, step outside, take one deep breath of morning air. He used to say, "Nothing good ever happens when you lose patience." Tears blurred the ink. I wiped them quickly, terrified I might smear his handwriting. I remembered Eleanor reading this very letter years ago when she was sorting through his belongings. I'd laughed, then called it one of his philosophical sermons. Now every word felt like a lifeline, a hand reaching from the past to pull me out of the darkness I hadn't realized I was sinking into. Clara said nothing while I read. She waited until I folded the letter carefully, then spoke softly. "You know, Mr. Parker, many people invest and forget, but very few are patient enough to let time reward them." I asked, "Did he pick some special stock?" She smiled. "He chose an S&P 500 index fund. Classic, steady, unspectacular. $10 a month for 40 years, compounding quietly. A perfect lesson in endurance." I leaned back, staring out the window. Outside, people crossed the streetcars, lined up at the light, the world rushing forward. And I thought of Parker Logistics, of Brian, of the meetings filled with jargon and projections, all those plans to optimize, to replace hands with algorithms. And it struck me my father, a man who never went to college, understood something that every so-called strategist I'd ever met had missed. Clara handed me a detailed statement. "The money's been moved through several reinvestments over the decades," she explained. "Always small, consistent, untouched. No withdrawals ever." I stared at the line that read, "Beneficiary Eugene Parker." The letters trembled in my sight. I asked quietly, "Do you think—" Eleanor might have kept it going after he passed. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. The contributions after 1999 came under a different name, but with your home address. I believe she did." I turned away before she could see my eyes. I saw Eleanor as clear as day, her hands holding the old passbook, her soft smile, her voice saying, "Saving isn't about money, Gene. It's about faith." And then I understood. They had both built an invisible net beneath my life, something to catch me when I fell, even if they weren't there to see it. Clara walked to the printer and gathered a fresh stack of papers. She clipped them neatly and handed them to me. "This is an interim summary," she said. "Our investment department will send the full report within a week." I took it, my voice rough. "Thank you." She paused as I turned to leave. "Mr. Parker," she said quietly, "a lot of people get rich fast and lose it just as fast, but only the patient end up wealthy and free." I stopped at the doorway, looking back. Sunlight filtered through the glass, washing the desk in a thin, golden haze. For a moment I saw my father there, hunched over his morning paper, and Eleanor beside him, pouring another cup of coffee. Two ordinary people. No degrees. No fame. But they'd understood something it took me a lifetime to learn. When I stepped outside, the wind had picked up. Clouds were gathering over Millhaven. I clutched the envelope and the notebook to my chest, afraid they might dissolve if I let go. In that moment I realized what I was holding wasn't just money. It was time and love and the quiet patience of two people who'd believed in both. I slid into the driver's seat. For the first time in years I laughed, a quiet, unguarded laugh that came from somewhere deep and warm. I started the engine, watching the raindrops form on the windshield. The world outside was still in a hurry. But me. For once, I just wanted to drive slow. That night, I sat alone at Eleanor's old writing desk. The room was dim, lit only by the small lamp she used to read under. The light pooled across the scarred wood, soft and golden. The air carried the faint scent of pine. The one she loved mingled with the dry musk of old paper. On the table lay my father's letter, carefully folded, and the investment notebook still open to its final page. I pulled a blank sheet toward me, uncapped my pen, and wrote a single line. If true value takes time, then I'll invest my time one more time. I stopped staring at the words until the ink bled slightly into the fibers. Then I set the pen down. It felt like signing a contract not with the world, but with myself. Outside, the rain had stopped. Water dripped rhythmically from the eaves, steady and patient. I looked up at Eleanor's framed photograph on the shelf. The light caught her face just enough to make her eyes seem alive again. Calm, certain. I whispered, "Maybe it's time, Ellie. But this time I won't build something for others to take. I'll build something no one can steal." By morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds, striking the desk in a warm diagonal glow. The ink on my page had dried to a faint shine. I woke early, brewed a pot of coffee, slipped on my old leather jacket, and picked up the phone. Joe answered first, his voice the same low gravel it had always been. "I want to meet a few of the old crew," I said. He paused. "What's this about Mr. Parker? Something worth starting again?" There was a beat of silence. Then he said, "I'll be there." Next, I called Lydia, the accountant who'd worked beside me for 15 years, and Tom Barlow, my father's old friend, a retired lawyer whose mind was still sharp as a blade. They all agreed to meet that afternoon at Helen's diner. I got there early. The place hadn't changed in decades. The warm, amber light, the small bell that chimed when the door opened, the smell of roasted beans that lingered in the air. Helen smiled when she saw me. "Mr. Parker," she said, "your usual table's still free." I took the corner seat by the window. Outside, the sky was a clean, washed blue after the storm. Shafts of sunlight fell across the table, turning the grain of the wood into streaks of silver. Joe came first. His jacket was damp with dew, the faint scent of motor oil still clinging to him. He sat down without asking what this was about, eyes fixed on me like he already knew it mattered. I ordered him a black coffee. Lydia arrived next, hair tied neatly, a folder tucked under her arm. She still had that calm precision that once held the company together when chaos threatened to split it apart. Tom followed, walking with a cane, his smile somewhere between wry and warm. The four of us sat around that small table, and for a moment it felt like time had bent backward, like we were all still part of something alive. I told them everything. About the investment my father had started in 1985. About Eleanor continuing it for 2 decades. About the letter. About the money. I hadn't known existed, nearly $2 million born from patience and faith. When I finished, silence filled the booth. Joe broke it first. "Well," he said, shaking his head slowly, "seems the universe finally evened the scales, Gene." I nodded. "Maybe. But it's not the money that brought me back to life." I told them about the letter, about my father's words, about not letting age or failure define a man's worth. Then I said quietly, "I'm not using this money to rest. I'm using it to rebuild. Not to win. To remember what they forgot, trust." Lydia opened her folder. Inside were several faded documents. "I still have the 2015 internal ledgers," she said. "There's something you should see." She handed me a note referencing the company's logistics software, the one we'd built in-house years ago. The last line read, "Copyright registered to Parker Freight Systems owner, Eugene Parker, not legally transferred." Tom leaned forward, nodding. "That means you still hold the rights. And if they're using it without license, you've got a legal path to re-enter the business." I tapped my fingers lightly on the table. Helen brought another round of coffee, the reflections of the overhead lights rippling across the dark surface. "I don't want to sue anyone," I said finally. "I've seen enough men destroy each other over pride. I just want to rebuild what was lost: integrity, fair work, faith in people." Tom smiled, slow and approving. "That's the hardest thing to build, Gene. And the only thing worth it." Joe placed his hand on my shoulder, rough, heavy, real. "You won't be doing it alone." I gripped his hand. His palm was still calloused, the same as when we loaded trucks together 40 years ago. Lydia asked, "Do you have a plan?" "Just an idea," I said. "I'll take that old software, update it. Keep it small, transparent. No investors, no debt, no promises we can't keep. A freight platform built on trust, not leverage. I'll call it Cedar Line, like the road that leads home." Joe chuckled. "Sounds like something people might actually believe in." Tom added, "And I can help you register it properly this time." We stayed there for hours, sketching ideas on napkins, mapping out steps like kids plotting a dream. Helen drifted by every so often, refilling cups, saying nothing, her eyes warm with quiet understanding. By the time we finished, the late afternoon light had turned the diner amber. The empty tables, the faint hum of an old jukebox, the scent of coffee and rain. It all felt like the beginning of something honest. Joe stood, stretching his back. "Still got my old rig," he said. "If you need a test truck, she's ready." Lydia smiled. "I'll dig through the tax records, see what assets can be revived." Tom laughed softly. "Seems American law still leaves a corner for honest men." I looked around the diner before we left. Everything was as it had always been. Same booths, same chipped counter, same hum of quiet life. Only we were older now. But in that age, I saw something the younger ones at Parker Logistics never understood: the kind of wisdom you buy with time, loyalty, and a few hard falls. Driving home, the sun was low, spilling gold across the treetops. I rolled the window down, letting the cold wind rush in. In my head, my father's words echoed again. True value takes time. And for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't waiting for time anymore. I was moving with it. I rented a small warehouse on the edge of Millhaven, a forgotten space that had sat empty for nearly a decade. The brick walls were dark with moss, and the old steel door groaned like a sigh every time I pulled it open. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it not decay, but beginning. No one believed me when I said I was starting over at 65. But in that heavy air, thick with dust and metal, I could hear something most people couldn't: the pulse of time circling back. On the first day, I brought a paint bucket, an old wooden ladder, and a pair of hands that trembled with age, but still remembered the weight of a roller. Each stroke of white paint across the gray wall felt like breathing out years of silence. Dust floated through the light like tiny embers, and for a moment I saw Eleanor's face in it, soft, smiling the way she'd stand at the doorway with her coffee, quietly watching me work. By evening, I mounted the new sign I'd carved myself: Parker Legacy Freight, since 1985. The letters cut deep into oak, proud and imperfect. I stepped back a few paces and watched them catch the sunset gold spilling across the wood, bringing it to life. On the desk inside, I placed Eleanor's photograph. In the frame, she was smiling, her hair caught mid-motion, eyes bright, as if she knew something I didn't. I whispered, "You see, Ellie, everything's still here. I just had to slow down enough to find my way back. Joe showed up on the second day carrying a toolbox, a box of apple pies, and that same warm laugh I hadn't heard in years. He looked around the space, whistled low. Hell, Gene, looks better than it ever did. Then he picked up a wrench and started inspecting the wiring. We're not hiring anyone new, I said. Just bringing back the ones who still remember what a promise is worth. He nodded, eyes lighting up, and immediately pulled out his phone to call a few old friends. 3 days later, 5 men walked through the door. All of them were former driver's men the world had labeled obsolete when the company went digital. They stood in the sunlight, cutting through the open bay faces, lined hands marked by years of labor. One of them laughed. I thought I'd actually retired. Maybe we just took a break, I said. That afternoon, the warehouse came alive. Laughter and the clang of tools echoed off the walls. We scrubbed windows, replaced light bulbs, tested the old rigs. Joe fired up his 1998 Freightliner, the same one he'd refused to sell. The engine coughed, then roared low and steady like the heartbeat of something that refused to die. There were no ads, no slogans, no apps, just work, sweat, trust. Near sunset, Helen arrived carrying a thermos of coffee and 2 apple pies. She stood in the doorway, eyes wet. Lord, I never thought I'd see you here again. I smiled. Take a picture for me, will you? She did. I stood in front of the warehouse, hands in my pockets, the oak sign glowing behind me as the sky burned orange. Helen snapped a few shots, then said, I'll post this on the diner page. Let folks know you're back. I shrugged. Doubt anyone will care. But I was wrong. That night, as I packed up my phone, wouldn't stop buzzing. A message from Helen Jean, you need to see this. The photo had spread across the local feed. Hundreds of comments. The real founder of Parker Freight is back. He's the reason I believed in this business. A young driver wrote, My dad used to tell me stories about him. Now I get why he respected the man so much. I sat down on an old chair, the phone's glow casting soft light on the concrete floor. My heart pounded the same rhythm I'd once thought belonged only to my younger years. Another message from Helen came in, people didn't forget Gene. They were just waiting for you to remind them. The next morning I arrived early. Joe was already there brewing coffee on a camping stove. He handed me a copy of the Ohio Ledger. On page 2 was a small article with the headline, The True Founder of Parker Freight Restarts His Journey. I read every line feeling as though I was looking at my life from outside the frame. Joe grinned. You know what this means, right? The whole town's talking about you. I shook my head. No, Joe. They're not talking about me. They're talking about what we used to believe in. Just then, the landline rang. I picked it up. A clear, confident female voice came through. Mr. Eugene Parker. This is Samantha Ellis from the Ohio Ledger. I'd like to hear your story, not the business story, but the truth. I looked out the window. The morning sun caught the wooden sign again, the word legacy, glowing like polished steel. Outside, Joe was wiping down the windshield of a truck, the smell of coffee and motor oil drifting in with the breeze, the scent of a life honestly lived. I tightened my grip on the receiver and smiled. Ms. Ellis. I said maybe it's time people heard the story from the man who actually built it. There was a pause on the other end, a kind of respectful silence. Then her voice came back softer now. I'll be in Millhaven tomorrow morning. Thank you, Mr. Parker. When I set the phone down, I realized something simple and undeniable. The fire inside me had never really gone out. It had just been waiting for the right time, the right place, and the right reason to burn again. The next morning, the sun had barely cleared the line of old factory roofs when the story spread through Millhaven. My picture standing in front of the wooden sign that read Parker Legacy Freight, since 1985, filled the front page of the Ohio Ledger. The headline alone was enough to make the whole town stop. The true founder of Parker Freight has returned. I read it at my desk, the coffee cold beside me. I hadn't sent a press release, hadn't asked for attention. But the thing I'd spent years keeping quiet had stepped back into the light on its own, as if justice had finally remembered the debt it owed. Joe finished reading and slapped my shoulder, half amused, half serious. Bet Brian's throwing a keyboard across his office right about now. I smiled, but said nothing. By noon, when a car screeched to a stop outside the warehouse, I knew Joe had been right. A black sedan with the Parker Logistics logo rolled into the yard. The doors opened, and out stepped Brian, followed by Eric Miles, the company's in-house counsel, a man who'd once drafted half my contracts. Both wore dark suits and walked in like they were entering a crime scene. Joe stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, watching carefully. I rose as they pushed open the office door without knocking. Brian didn't greet me, didn't sit. His voice came sharp, rehearsed. "You're violating your non-compete clause." I looked at him, his neatly parted hair, the cold precision in his face, and for a moment I saw not my son, but a stranger built out of ambition. I pulled an old folder from the drawer and set it on the desk. "That clause expired last month," I said, quietly, steady. I pointed to the fine print written ironically by Eric himself. Eric leaned in, reading it, then nodded once, saying nothing. Brian stepped closer, his tone dropping. "You're digging yourself a hole, Dad. No one's going to believe in some rusted-out warehouse. The world's moved on." I met his stare. My voice stayed calm, iron, under the surface. "I carried the name Parker 30 years before you did. It's not a brand, son. It's a promise." He gave a sharp, bitter laugh. "You're stuck in the past. Even Mom said you should have stopped. The world passed you by." The mention of Eleanor hit like a blade between ribs. The air shifted colder, heavier. I held his gaze. "Your mother believed in values, not market share. That's what you never understood." Eric cleared his throat, stepping between us. "Mr. Parker, we're only here to clarify the situation. No one wants to escalate this legally." I nodded slowly. "Then let time handle it. It's better at finding truth than any courtroom. Nothing built on ingratitude lasts long." Silence fell. Only the clock ticked and the wind sighed through the cracks. Brian lingered a moment longer. His voice came flat, sharp as glass. "You're burying your own name." I said, "No, son. I'm doing what you never learned to do, rebuilding, not burying." He turned and slammed the door. The car engine growled, then faded away down the road. Joe stepped in, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You all right, Gene?" I looked at the sign on the wall. The paint still fresh, the oak still warm to the touch. "I'm fine," I said. "Just an old wound that finally got its stitches pulled." Joe sat across from me, sighing. "You gonna sue him?" I shook my head. "I don't need a judge to prove I'm right. I just need time. And time, Joe. It's fairer than people." That afternoon we went back to work. Joe and the drivers wiped down the trucks, the sound of engines filling the space like heartbeats returning to life. I walked through the warehouse, checking every wire, every beam, every scar of rust. Each mark told a story. As the sun dipped low, dust turned gold in the light. For a moment I stood between 2 worlds, the one I'd lost and the one I was building from its ashes. When Joe shut the main doors, I saw it the first truck freshly painted. On its white side, the words Parker Legacy Freight gleamed clean and proud. I ran my hand across the paint, smooth, cool, alive. The smell of solvent and diesel carried me back to that morning in 1985, when I'd driven my first delivery. Eleanor had stood on the porch, waving, calling out, "Don't forget, Gene. Some things are worth more than profit." Night settled. I sat alone in my small office, the lamp casting a narrow cone of light on my father's old ledger. I turned to the last page. His handwriting, still strong, slanted with purpose. When they take your reputation, don't fight to reclaim it. Build a new one, quieter, stronger, and entirely your own. I picked up my pen and wrote beneath it, "Father, I'm doing exactly that, one day at a time." Joe knocked softly. "Got some news," he said. "A few local businesses called in the lumber yard, the bakery, even Helen's diner. They want to book shipments." I raised an eyebrow. "They know we've only got one truck." He grinned. "They said they'll wait. They trust a man who keeps his word." I nodded, voice low. "Then we start." Joe left, closing the door behind him. I turned off the lamp and sat for a while in the dark. Through the window, the truck's headlights swept across the wooden sign outside, lighting up the words, "Since 1985, like embers that refused to die." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain through the cracks, not mournful, but defiant. I looked up at the gray sky and felt something steady settle in my chest. Brian could keep the company, the profits, the spotlight. But he couldn't keep faith. I'd lost my name once, lost my family once. But the one thing I never lost was the will to rise. And that night, standing in the quiet hum of the warehouse, I knew I'd done the one thing Eleanor always believed: I could keep the flame that time could never extinguish, only teach to burn deeper. Spring arrived late in Millhaven. The young oaks along the highway were just beginning to open their leaves tender green against a pale, forgiving sky. The warehouse had changed beyond recognition. Maps of new freight routes covered the walls. The white trucks stood in precise rows outside their polished sides, catching the morning sun. Every dawn, I'd hear the engines start, that low human rhythm of men talking, laughing, working. And beneath it all, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. Quiet, unassuming peace. I wasn't looking for recognition, but somehow the world had decided to talk about what was happening here. One morning in April, Samantha Ellis called again. Her voice held a mix of surprise and disbelief. "Your story's spreading farther than I thought," she said. 3 weeks later, her second article appeared on the front page of the Ohio Ledger, then rippled outward: Dayton, Cleveland, Toledo. The headline stretched across the fold like a confession: father fired by son. Builds a legacy from scratch. In the photograph, I stood in front of a truck, whined, tossing my gray hair, the Parker Legacy Freight logo glowing behind me. The caption read, "This isn't just a story about work. It's about loyalty and patience." I didn't read the article right away, but Joe did. He recited parts of it while oiling the hinges on the loading bay door. "She wrote that you chose not to fight back with lawsuits," he said, "but with decency and endurance." Old friends started writing to me. Messages, letters, even a few phone calls. One note said, "You made us believe again that integrity still has a place in business." But just as those words reached me, so did other whispers Parker Logistics was in trouble. The first to tell me was Lydia. She called late one evening, voice low. "I heard First National is reviewing their loan files," she said. Eric Miles signed off on some questionable mortgages. I sat by the window listening to the wind press against the glass. I'd always known Eric had a talent for hiding things, and Brian for trusting the wrong man. Joe said it best the next day. I don't pity them. I just feel sorry. They had everything except humility. 2 weeks later, Samantha called again. I want to write a follow-up, she said. Not about money, about patience. If you believe people still care about stories like that, I told her, then write it. Her voice softened almost like a breeze. Trust me, Mr. Parker. They don't just want to read it. They need to. By mid-June, her piece had spread across the entire state, even reaching Columbus and Cincinnati. The photo showed me at my desk a small wooden sign behind me that read, "Legacy, not Empire." The opening line said, when fired by his own son at 65, Eugene Parker didn't sue, didn't protest. He simply began again with the same hands that built the company in 1985. Meanwhile, Parker Logistics began to fracture. The banks froze their secondary accounts. Minor shareholders dumped their stock. In public, the company pretended calm, but calls began coming in from employees people I once mentored, describing an office as cold and sterile as a hospital ward. Eric Miles had been summoned before the state commission. I said nothing, just drank my coffee and looked out at the warehouse yard. I'd told Joe once that time has its own way of returning what's been taken. Now I was watching it happen quietly, precisely like a clock unwinding. One Friday afternoon, while I was reviewing shipment papers, Joe stepped in. They invited Brian to speak on Channel 8, he said, to respond to the article. I looked up, and he refused. Said he doesn't want to talk about the past. I nodded. Sometimes silence is the most honest reply. 3 weeks later, the news broke. Parker Logistics had filed for Chapter 11. Bankruptcy. The bank confirmed a $15 million loan had been misused. Eric Miles was under investigation. I read the headline on my phone. No anger, no triumph. Just an emptiness spreading through my chest, the kind that comes when the inevitable finally arrives. That evening, Samantha showed up at the warehouse. She wore a beige trench coat, hair tied back, a small recorder in her hand. I'm not here for an interview, she said. I just want to ask one thing. Do you feel vindicated? I looked at her carefully. There was no performance in her face, no journalist's calculation, only a quiet curiosity. I walked to the counter, poured 2 cups of coffee, and handed her one. No, I said. I just think time did what it was supposed to do. Some people need lessons, and sometimes those lessons don't come through punishment, they come through their own results. She sat still, eyes lowered, and then said softly, I think you understand something the rest of the world's forgotten, that justice isn't noise, it's patience. We didn't speak after that. Outside, Joe and the drivers were preparing for tomorrow's run. The engines rumbled in rhythm with the wind sliding over the open fields. Through the window I could see the wooden sign catching the last of the sunlight. Samantha left as dusk fell, the smell of coffee lingering in the air long after she was gone. I stood in the doorway for a while, watching the white trucks resting in the yard, their sides glowing red in the fading light. A chapter had ended, but I knew the story wasn't finished. Outside, the wind carried the scent of coming rain. I closed the door, looked up at Eleanor's photograph on the wall, and spoke quietly. You see, Ellie, I kept my promise. Justice doesn't always need a courtroom, just time. And time, like you always said, stands with those who know how to wait. That morning, Millhaven was still wrapped in mist. The red brick roofs glistened faintly with dew, and the air felt so still it was as if the whole town were holding its breath. I stood in the yard with a cup of coffee warming my hands, watching the new trucks lined up in a perfect row, white freshly painted, the words Parker Legacy Freight printed bold across every trailer like a quiet declaration. It wasn't a delivery day. It was a day I'd known would come, a reckoning no one wanted, but that time never forgets to deliver. I slipped my wedding ring back on. The metal had dulled over the years, scratched and thinned, but when the sunlight touched it, it still caught the light the way Eleanor used to. I had taken it off after her funeral, when my hands shook too much to hold a cup steady. Now sliding it back on felt like stitching a missing piece of my soul back into place. I whispered, almost to myself, "Today, I'll do it the way you would have wanted, with calm, not anger." A silver sedan rolled into the yard, dust clinging to its sides. Brian stepped out. Gray suit, loose tie, his face thinner drawn. For a moment I didn't recognize the man who once laughed beside his mother on the day we opened the company back in 2005. He walked slowly, shoulders heavy, eyes lowered, no longer the proud CEO, just a man trying to hold together what little dignity he had left. I didn't move, just waited. He passed the line of trucks, their new paint catching the morning light. When his gaze met the name Legacy Freight, he paused. I saw it, that flicker of recognition, the sting in his pride. Because legacy doesn't belong to the one who inherits. It belongs to the one who builds. He stopped a few feet away, voice tired, rough. "You wanted to see me. I'm here." I nodded toward the office. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and pine. Sunlight streamed through the window, falling across Eleanor's photograph. Brian's eyes lingered there for a second, then darted away. I laid a thick folder on the desk. "This," I said slowly, "is the contract for the old downtown property where Parker Logistics had its headquarters." He frowned, voice hoarse. "Why would you buy that?" "Not to show off," I said. "Not to get even. To reclaim what I built. I didn't buy your company, Brian. I bought back the values you forgot." He was silent. His hand rested on the desk, trembling slightly, the same hands that once loaded boxes beside me, steady and strong. "You once told me I was too old to understand the world," I continued. "But time is the harshest teacher. It teaches what no classroom or conference ever could." Brian looked up, his eyes dim and weary. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "I just wanted to be recognized." I smiled faintly, not bitter, just sad. "Son, recognition isn't something you demand. You earn it by recognizing others first. Your mother used to say when someone stops listening, they stop deserving blessings." He exhaled, his shoulders sinking. "I was wrong," he murmured. "I turned the company into something you wouldn't even recognize." I didn't answer right away. I walked to the window. Outside, the trucks gleamed in the light. "Do you know why those men came back?" I asked. "It's not for money. They came back because they still believe the name Parker means something. Not power, not profit, but trust." He stood beside me, staring out at the yard. After a long pause, he said, "I thought modernization was the only way forward." "There's nothing wrong with moving forward," I said. "The mistake is forgetting to look back. I never blamed you for changing things. I was only sad you forgot why I started." Silence filled the room. The ticking clock sounded like a heartbeat, slow, deliberate. I turned to him. "I don't have many years left to prove anything, but I still have enough to do what's right. You can start again if you really want to." He looked up, eyes rimmed red. Then all at once he collapsed into the chair, hands covering his face. I was arrogant, he said, his voice breaking. I thought I could make you proud, and all I did was hurt you. I stepped closer, placed a hand on his shoulder. It trembled just like it had when he was a boy after breaking a picture frame and waiting for me to scold him. Eleanor used to tell me, I said softly, never lose mercy even for those who hurt you. Mercy, she said, is the truest sign of strength. He lifted his head, eyes clearer now. If I want to make it right, he asked, where do I start? Start by listening, I said, and by respecting the people you once overlooked. You don't need their forgiveness, just don't repeat the mistake. He nodded slowly, scanning the room, the desk, the tools, the framed photo before his gaze settled on the trucks outside. Mom would be proud of you, he whispered. She'd be proud of both of us, I said. If you learn the lesson she spent her life teaching, don't let success cost you your character. We walked outside together. The sun had risen higher, pouring gold across the yard. Joe was directing the driver's testing brakes. The echo of engines rolled against the walls. Brian stopped by the gate, watching the wooden sign sway in the breeze. I used to think legacy was something carved on a gravestone, he said quietly. Not painted on a truck. I smiled. Sometimes the things that last longest aren't written on signs, they live in how people remember you. He nodded, lips trembling slightly, then turned and walked away. I stood there watching the silver sedan disappear down the dirt road toward the highway. When it was gone, I turned back to the rows of white trucks gleaming under the sunlight and to the photograph of Eleanor hanging in my office window. You see, Ellie, I whispered. He's finally listening. 3 months passed. Millhaven slid into autumn, the way an old man eases into a familiar coat, slowly, gently, with a sigh. The sunlight turned heavier, burnished to a deep gold, and the wind carried the dry, comforting scent of cut grass from the fields beyond the warehouse. Parker Legacy Freight no longer looked like the humble venture it once was. The yard was full now, white trucks lined up in neat formation chrome, catching the light. Inside, laughter carried down the hallways. And every time a convoy rolled out, I caught, for a fleeting second, the faces of men who once believed their names had been forgotten. Joe often said we weren't in the business of making money anymore. We were rebuilding faith. I think he was right. Some things once broken can only be repaired by the same hands that broke them. That afternoon I stood in the quiet of the warehouse, holding my father's old investment ledger. The cover was frayed, the ink faded, but still legible. IRA 1985. The paper had yellowed, but it still smelled faintly of cedar and ink, the scent of a patient kind of hope. 40 years. I whispered the number like a prayer. 40 years since my father had begun putting away $10 a month, believing in something that outlasts profit time. I decided then to hold a small gathering. Nothing grand. No speeches, no guests in suits, just the people who had weathered the years with me and were still here to see what remained. By the next evening, the warehouse looked almost ceremonial. Helen brought her pecan pie. Lydia came with Lavender Eleanor's favorite. Joe built a wooden sign by hand, his old calligraphy shaky but dignified, 40 years of time and trust. Samantha showed up with her camera, saying she wanted a few pictures for her final piece, not about business this time, but about belief. When everything was ready, the light outside began to soften. The last rays of the sun spilled through the high windows, scattering across the long wooden table, where I'd placed 2 framed photographs, my father's and Eleanor's. I sat there for a while, watching the dust shimmer in the air. It felt as though they were both still here, Not ghosts, not memories, but presences. Quiet, patient, proud. People gathered around the table. The chatter dimmed. Joe stood beside me, poured 2 glasses of bourbon older than both of us cared to admit. I raised mine, but didn't give a toast. Instead, I spoke softly, voice low, steady, measured. I once lost the person I loved most, I said. And for a long time I thought the world had taken with her every reason I had left to go on. But I learned that what remains after loss isn't emptiness. It's the part of us we never knew existed, silent, steady, waiting for us to come back. The warehouse fell silent. Outside, the wind rustled through the dry fields, the faint hum of engines idling beyond the wall. Helen placed her hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Eleanor would be proud." I nodded. I know. Maybe she was right there in the light, slanting through the windows, in the scent of lavender, in the low, mechanical hum that had always been the pulse of our lives. I looked at Eleanor's picture and smiled. She'd once told me true worth never disappears. It just waits for someone patient enough to find it again. I raised my glass once more. The bourbon caught the light, scattering gold across the table. To those who stayed, I said to those who left, and to the things that never decay, trust, decency, and time. The clinking of glasses rang out, soft, resonant, like the sound of metal catching wind. Joe touched his glass gently to mine, eyes wet but smiling. Lydia turned her face away, and Samantha, wordless, clicked her camera, capturing a moment she didn't need to caption. When the gathering ended, the warehouse slowly emptied. The echoes of laughter faded into the smell of wood bourbon and memory. Joe and I stayed behind to clean. He picked up the remaining glasses, chuckling. "Haven't seen you this alive in a long while." I was about to answer when I heard the door open. Brian stood in the doorway, framed by the unsteady light of a single bulb. No suit, no tie. Just a blue shirt, jeans, and a face thinned by time and consequence. His eyes were different, not cold anymore, but worn, remorseful, searching. He stood there for a long time, like a man asking permission to come home. I looked at him, then nodded. He stepped inside, slow and unsure. His gaze landed on the photographs of my father and Eleanor. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse. "Mom would be proud of you." I set my glass down and replied softly, "And your grandfather would hope you do something to make her proud." He bowed, his head, shoulders trembling. Then after a breath, he stepped forward and reached out his hand. It was the first handshake since the day everything fell apart. His palm was cold, but his grip firm, certain. No apologies, no promises, just truth and a quiet surrender. Joe saw it from across the room. He gave a small nod, then turned away, pretending to tidy the table. "I don't need you to run the company," I said gently. "I just need you to remember some things can't be owned. They can only be honored by living right." Brian's eyes shone as he nodded. Outside, the wind picked up again. The scent of lavender drifted across the room, mingling with the whiskey, and the wood, the air heavy with something that felt both old and new. I glanced toward my father's photograph. The light hit it in just the right way, and for a fleeting second I could swear he was smiling proud that the Parker bloodline had finally learned the lesson he spent a lifetime teaching. Brian turned to leave. At the doorway, he looked back once more and said quietly, "I'll try." I didn't answer. I just smiled. When he was gone, I heard the wind sweep through the yard, shaking the old wooden sign, "Parker Legacy Freight," since 1985. The word legacy caught the light, glowing like an ember that refused to die. I stood there for a long time, staring out into the quiet yard, the rows of trucks gleaming under a sky dusted with stars. The night air was cool, the kind that stings gently before it soothes. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, there was no anger, no ache, no unfinished thought. Just peace, steady, earned, and whole. Dawn unfolded over Millhaven, like a painting brushed into life by the breath of time. The first light slipped through the row of pines behind the house, spilling across the wooden porch where I sat. Before me, a cup of coffee steamed quietly, and beside it lay my father's old letter, resting against a framed photograph of Eleanor. Two remnants, one from the distant past, the other from my heart lying side by side, like the twin halves of a life I once lost somewhere in the storm. Outside, the sound of engines rose from the warehouse. Joe and the drivers were getting ready for the Cleveland route. I heard the clang of metal, the slam of doors, and their laughter bouncing against the morning air. I'd heard those sounds for 30 years, but never had they felt this warm. Maybe because now, for the first time, I wasn't racing against time, I was walking alongside it. I lifted the cup. The heat settled into my hands, thawing the morning chill. On the table, the glass frame caught the sunlight and Eleanor's face glowed softly through it. "Ellie," I whispered. "I finally understand." It was never about winning or revenge, it was about keeping what's worth living with. I wasn't angry at Brian anymore. Anger, I had learned, is just another wall we build between people who share the same blood. You once said time doesn't heal, it teaches us how to live with the wound. Now I believe you. I opened my father's letter again. The last line always made my chest tighten. If you're reading this, sun life must have brought you to your knees. But remember, real value takes time. And patience is the only asset no one can steal. I pressed the letter against my chest and closed my eyes. My breath moved with the wind. For a moment I thought I could hear his voice in the breeze, rough and steady, the same tone he used the day he taught me how to start our first truck. I stepped off the porch. The cold air moved through my sleeves, the scent of coffee blending with damp pine. From the distance, a white truck rolled out of the yard. The Parker Legacy Freight logo gleamed on the side, and beneath it, since 1985, shimmered like a promise etched in metal and time. I watched it move through the fog down the dirt road lined with morning dew, and for the first time in my life, I realized each truck wasn't just carrying freight, it was carrying years. Mine, Eleanor's, my father's, and the years of every soul who still believed that honesty had a place in this world. Joe waved from the lot, his voice echoing across the field. "We'll be back before sundown, Mr. Parker." I lifted my hand, smiled, didn't answer. I stood there until the sound of the engine faded into the wind, and only the faint trace of diesel hung in the air. "Ellie," I said softly, "if you can hear me, know this. I'm not afraid of time anymore. I used to think it was an enemy, something that stole everything we loved. But now I know it's the most patient teacher of all. It doesn't rush. It doesn't speak. It just waits until we slow down enough to understand what it's been trying to show us." I sat back down and opened the old leather notebook Eleanor had given me the day we married. I began to write, "Time doesn't grow old. It enriches what deserves to last. Those who know how to wait will never be poor. Those who've known loss will never be empty. And wounds, when tended with patience, eventually bloom into flowers." I paused, lifted my gaze. The sky had turned the color of honey. The fog had melted from the grass. From the warehouse, I heard the wooden door creak open, Joe's boots on the gravel, the chime of the old wind bells outside. Everything was still yet alive, not the stillness of endings, but the kind that lingers after a song has finished, when the final note hangs in the air, long enough to be felt, not heard. I placed my hand on Eleanor's photograph. My voice came out quiet, but sure. Thank you, Ellie, for teaching me that love doesn't vanish, it just changes form. And thank you, Dad, for believing that if you invest in the right things, in people, in decency, in trust, then even $10 a month can build a lifetime. Thank you for listening. That's my story. And if you too believe that patience never ages, share it. Like it. Subscribe. Because justice doesn't always come in noise. Sometimes it arrives in the silence of time. And when time finally speaks, it has never once been wrong.